November 15th, 1834. Two 9-year-old girls walked into a church no map remembered, and in 3 days they tore every hidden sin out of that congregation like splinters from living flesh. They knew secrets that died with the dead. They knew where the bodies were. And when they spoke, the floorboards themselves started to bleed. The mist in the Cumberland foothills doesn't lift. It clings. It remembers. In the winter of 1834, when Kentucky was still half wild and the hand of man had only begun to bruise the ancient ridges, there was a settlement called Pine Hollow that most cartographers simply left off their parchment. You could ride a day and a half from the nearest trading post and still hear only the wind arguing with the pines. 200 souls, mostly kin, lived there under the iron rule of a single wooden church and the even heavier rule of silence. On the evening of November 15th, just as the last bruised light bled out behind the mountains, 3 travelers limped into that silence. The man was tall, bent like a storm-broken sapling, his gray hair the color of creek silt. His coat had been patched so many times the original cloth was only a rumor. In his right hand, he carried a leather satchel that held everything he owned, a water-stained Bible, a stub of candle, and a journal bound in cracked calfskin. Clinging to his legs were 2 little girls, identical as 2 drops of rain, wrapped in the same threadbare shawl the color of dried blood. Their names were Rebecca and Rachel Morrison, 9 winters old. Born the night their mother screamed her last breath into a blizzard that buried 3 counties. The church bell gave one tired clang as Pastor William Phillips locked the doors after Wednesday prayer. He saw the silhouettes first, 3 shadows against the dying sky, and felt something colder than mountain air slide between his ribs. He would write that night in the careful copperplate he reserved for the most terrible things. They looked like any weary travelers, until the lamplight touched their eyes. Then I understood why the dogs would not stop howling. Inside the Phillips cabin, the fire crackled low and ashamed, as if it too had secrets. Mrs. Phillips, Abigail, ladled bean soup into wooden bowls while trying not to stare. The girl sat on the bench, knees together, hands folded with unnatural stillness. Rebecca, the elder by 7 minutes, smiled the way sunrise smiles, sudden warm, impossible to look away from. Rachel watched everything from beneath lowered lashes, the way a cat watches a room before it decides whether to burn it down. Abigail tried small talk. She mentioned her roses, how the blight 3 summers ago had nearly taken every bloom. Rebecca tilted her head. They came back stronger, the child said softly. The ones by the eastern fence. Red as Pentecost. You sang to them when no one was listening. The spoon slipped from Abigail's fingers and clattered like a gunshot. She had never told a soul about the singing. Pastor Phillips pretended not to notice. He was busy watching the way the firelight moved across the twins' faces, how it seemed to hesitate, as though even flame feared getting too close. That night, in the tiny loft the Phillips family surrendered to their guests, the girls slept curled together like 2 halves of the same heart. Downstairs, Ezekiel Morrison sat at the table long after the house grew quiet. He opened his journal, dipped the quill, and wrote a single line he would never show another living soul. They had begun dreaming the dead again. Morning came gray and reluctant. Frost feathered the windows like the fingerprints of ghosts trying to get back in. Pastor Phillips found Ezekiel exactly where he'd left him, unshaven, unblinking, staring into cold ashes. The dreams were bad, the preacher said without greeting, worse than any before. Before Phillips could ask what that meant, a small voice drifted down the ladder from the loft. Pastor Phillips? Rebecca stood at the top rung, barefoot, nightgown hanging loose on her narrow shoulders. Behind her, Rachel's silhouette hovered like smoke. There's something under your church floor, Rebecca said, matter of fact as a child reciting catechism. 3rd board from the altar, counting from the left. Phillips felt his stomach fold in on itself. Rachel spoke next, so softly he had a strain to hear. It's wrapped in blue, the color the baby never got to wear. 5 years earlier, William and Abigail Phillips had buried a son who never drew breath. The scrap of blanket they'd sewn for him, soft flannel the color of a summer sky, had vanished the same week Phillips fell into the bottle. He had told himself it was lost. He had lied. He wrapped the whiskey in that blue remnant. The night temptation finally overpowered prayer. Hid it beneath the sanctuary floor, where he would have to kneel above his own shame every Sunday. No one knew, not even Abigail. Phillips looked up at the girls, at these two small prophets wearing children's skin, and felt the floor tilt beneath him like a ship taking on water. That was all he managed. Rebecca descended the ladder with the careful grace of someone much older. She placed her hand over his trembling one. "We don't choose what we see," she whispered. "We only carry it." That Sunday, the church filled long before the bell rang. Word travels faster than horses in places where there is nothing else to do but talk. Every pew groaned. Babes were hushed with desperate hands over mouths. Old men who hadn't darkened a church door in years stood shoulder to shoulder at the back, faces carved from hickory and suspicion. Rachel Morrison preached like a man trying to outrun something behind him. His text was Psalm 139, "Whither shall I go from thy spirit?" And every soul in the room felt the question aimed squarely between their eyes. But the real sermon began when the preaching stopped. As the last amen faded, Rebecca and Rachel stepped into the center aisle. They moved in perfect unison, as though pulled by the same invisible string. The congregation held its breath the way a deer holds its breath when it smells the rifle. Rebecca approached Samuel Turner first, broad-shouldered, prosperous, the man who always put the largest coins in the plate. She had to crane her neck to meet his eyes. "You borrowed from God," she said gently. "But borrowing becomes stealing when you lie about paying it back." Turner's face went the color of tallow. 6 months earlier, he had begun siphoning collection money to cover a failed riverboat investment. He had calculated exactly how much he could take without anyone noticing. He had miscalculated the attention of heaven. Rachel drifted to Martha Whitfield, 81 years old, spine curved like a shepherd's crook, guardian of every moral standard Pine Hollow possessed. "Your husband didn't die in the accident," Rachel murmured, so low only Martha and the front 2 rows could hear. "He sends letters from Missouri. You keep them in the sugar tin behind the flour barrel." Martha's lips moved soundlessly. 15 years she had carried the lie of widowhood like a second skin. 15 years of respect bought with one merciful fiction. The letters, creased thin as onion skin, were indeed hidden exactly where the child said. One by one the twins moved through the sanctuary, touching no one, yet laying every soul bare. To Dr. Elias Hayes, "The widow Grayson didn't die of fever. She died because you bled her when her blood was already too thin." To the Miller family, "Your boy isn't dead. He's in the attic. He likes it when you read him the Psalms, even though he can't answer back." To 16-year-old Thomas Brett, red-faced beside his furious father, "Mrs. Carter's husband will be home Tuesday. He always comes home early when the river's low." Each revelation landed like a hammer on raw bone. No shouting, no accusation, just quiet, surgical truth delivered in children's voices. Then Rebecca walked to the front. She laid one small hand on the rough-hewn cross that had hung above the altar since 1818. The wood was dark with 16 winters of candle smoke and unspoken guilt. "This cross remembers blood," she said clearly. "4 people's worth." A sound escaped Pastor Phillips, half sob, half prayer. Rebecca turned to face the room. The Whitman family didn't burn in their cabin. They burned right here, behind the altar, while some of you watched. The silence that followed was not the silence of a church. It was the silence of a tomb that has just realized it is occupied. Elder Josiah Thompson, 73 years old, one of the 3 men who had hammered the first nail into this building, rose slowly. His hand shook so badly the pew creaked like it might snap. "Little girl," he said, voice gravel in grief, "you are speaking of things that happened before your grandmothers drew breath. Careful what doors you open." Rachel stepped forward. For the first time that morning, her voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. Faith Whitman had a birthmark shaped like a sparrow on her left shoulder. Hope had one like a crescent moon on her right ankle. Faith carried the doll her papa carved from Applewood. Hope wore the locket with the curl of her mama's hair. When they died, Faith was in her blue Sunday dress. Hope had fever and was still in her nightgown. Old women began to weep without sound. Men stared at the floorboards as if they might open and swallow them whole. Rachel wasn't finished. They came here for sanctuary, she said. Someone was chasing them with torches and worse. They hid behind the altar and begged. But the door was barred from the inside. She pointed one small finger at the exact spot where the communion table now stood. That's why the dogs won't cross the threshold after dark. That's why the roses by the eastern fence grow redder than anywhere else in the county. They're still drinking. Pastor Phillips found himself on his knees, though he had no memory of falling. The whiskey bottle, the blue blanket, the lies, the graves under sacred ground. Everything collapsed inside him at once. From the back of the church, Rachel Morrison spoke for the first time since the service began. His voice was raw, exhausted, ancient. "My daughters do not speak by their own power," he said. "They speak because some sins grow so heavy they begin to speak for themselves. And when they do, even children can hear them scream." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters like bones in a box. Inside, no one moved. No one dared. Because every soul in that room now understood the same terrible truth. The twins had not come to Pine Hollow to bring revival. They had come to force a reckoning 16 years overdue. And the ground beneath the church, the ground that had drunk innocent blood, was finally, after all this time, thirsty for justice. The air inside the Pine Hollow church turned thick as wet wool. Every soul stood frozen in the aisle, breath fogging in the November cold that somehow felt colder inside the sanctuary than out. Pastor William Phillips gripped the edge of the pulpit so hard the old oak groaned like it might split. The twins, Rebecca and Rachel, stood hand in hand beneath the crude wooden cross, small as sparrows, yet suddenly the tallest things in the room. Phillips found his voice first, though it cracked like thin ice. "Mr. Morrison, in the name of all that is holy, how do your daughters know these things?" Rachel Morrison looked older than the mountains behind him. His eyes, gray as grave dirt, moved slowly across the congregation, lingering on every face that had just been flayed open by two children's words. "I have carried that question like a millstone for 9 years," he said at last. His voice was soft, but it filled the rafters the way storm wind fills a hollow log. Their mother, my Sarah, had the sight. She could find lost cows, feel rain before the clouds gathered, knew when death was walking toward the cabin. But what lives in Rebecca and Rachel? It is not her gift grown larger. It is something older, something that was waiting for empty vessels pure enough to hold it. He looked down at his daughters. For the first time since arriving, the girls seemed small. Rebecca's lip trembled. Rachel pressed closer to her sister, the way a candle flame leans toward its twin before the wind snuffs them both. Rebecca spoke, so quietly the front pew had to lean forward to hear. "We don't pick the dreams, Pastor. They pick us. Sometimes we see pretty things, wedding dresses, new babies, spring coming early. But mostly," her voice cracked, "mostly we see what people try to bury. The Whitman girls come most nights now. They stand at the foot of our bed and ask why no one ever said their real names over their graves." Rachel lifted her head. Her eyes were dry but ancient. "They're cold," she whispered. "They've been cold since 1818. A low moan escaped Martha Whitfield. Someone else began to weep without sound. Elder Josiah Thompson stared at the floorboards as though he could see straight through them into hell. Pastor Phillips felt the walls tilting. He had come to Pine Hollow 5 years earlier, fleeing the noisy arguments of Lexington theologians. Predestination versus free will, baptism by immersion or sprinkling. Childish quarrels compared to this. He had wanted simple faith, honest labor, a quiet flock. Instead, he had inherited a tomb. That night, he could not pray. The familiar words turned to ash on his tongue. He lit a second candle, then a third, until his small study glowed like a forge. From the bottom of a cedar chest, he dragged out every ledger, every fragment left by his predecessor, Pastor Moriah Hayes. Most entries were neat, dutiful, comfortingly dull. But the winter of 1818 to 19 was different. Whole weeks were missing. The page for December 21st, 1818, the night the Whitman family supposedly burned, was almost blank. House fire. Jacob Whitman, Mary, daughters Hope and Faith taken to glory. Buried 23rd, Lord receive them. That was all. For lives reduced to 14 words. Phillips remembered wondering, even then, why Pastor Hayes, normally so meticulous, had written so little about such tragedy. Now he understood. Some stories are too heavy to lift on a paper. He was turning another brittle page when his fingers brushed something that should not have been there, a thin leather cord marking a place near the back. Tucked between the final pages was a second, smaller, journal no bigger than a hymn book, its cover warped by damp. The first line nearly stopped his heart. If any man of God should ever read this after I am gone, know that what we did was done in fear, not hatred. May Christ have mercy on us all. For 3 hours Phillips read by guttering candlelight, and with every paragraph the room grew colder. Pastor Hayes had written in torment. December 20th, 1818. Jacob Whitman came to me shaking with rage. He has proof. Horseshoes he forged for beasts whose owners were never seen again. A money bag with blood still crusted in the seams. A gold watch stopped at the hour its owner died. He demands public confession tomorrow, or he will ride to the county seat and bring the law down on every head. Thompson, Carver, and young Foster beg me to reason with him. They say the settlement will starve without the traveler's benevolence. God forgive me, I do not know what to counsel. December 22nd. It is finished. They came to the church for sanctuary near midnight. Jacob carrying Faith, Mary clutching Hope who burned with fever. I opened the door. Then Thompson barred it behind them. I heard the children scream. Then silence thicker than death. At dawn we carried what was left to the foundation trench we had already dug for the new meeting house. We mixed the lime quick and high. No one will ever know. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. I have built thy house on innocent blood. The last entry was only 3 words, scrawled so hard the quill had torn the paper. I hear them. Phillips closed the journal. His hands would not stop shaking. Outside, the wind moved through the pines like a dirge. A soft knock made him flinch so hard the candle toppled and went out. He opened the door to moonlight and Rebecca Morrison standing alone on the threshold, barefoot in her nightgown, braids neat as though she had dressed for church. You found it, she said simply. The little black book behind the loose stone. Phillips could only nod. Faith showed me where Pastor Hayes hid it, she continued. She was proud of him for writing the truth, even when he was too afraid to speak it. She stepped inside without being invited and sat on the 3-legged stool by the dead hearth. They didn't mean to kill the little girls, she said, voice small. They only wanted Papa Jacob to be quiet. But Hope had fever and started crying. Someone put a hand over her mouth too long. Phillips felt the room spin. Child, how can you bear it, knowing things like this? Rebecca looked up. Tears glimmered but did not fall. Jesus knows every sparrow that falls, she whispered. But sometimes the sparrows ask us to tell where they landed. She stood. Tomorrow a man on a bay horse will come from Lexington. He's looking for his brother's watch. It's time. Then she was gone, the door closing without a sound, leaving only moonlight and the smell of fresh-turned grave dirt that had not been there before. Dawn came red as judgment. The Morrison family had planned to leave after breakfast, their 3-day stay already stretched by the chaos of Sunday, but the road would have to wait. A lone rider appeared on the eastern trail, coat flapping like a crow's wing. He reined in before the church, mud-spattered and grim. Thomas Brennan, solicitor, Lexington, he announced, swinging down. I seek information regarding one Marcus Webb, traveler, disappeared in these parts December 1818. His brother's estate hangs in limbo. The name struck Phillips like a rifle ball. Marcus Webb, mentioned 3 times in Hayes's hidden journal. Before he could speak, Rebecca stepped from the shadows of the porch, Rachel a half-step behind. Mr. Webb's watch has a crack across the glass, Rebecca said conversationally. He dropped it when his horse slipped on ice. The initials inside are MW in curling letters. Brennan went very still. That detail was never published, he said slowly. Ow! Rachel pointed toward the cemetery with one small finger. Elder Thompson buried it behind the church with the money bag and the bridle bit still in the horse's teeth. He prays over that spot every new moon, but the prayers don't take. A circle of onlookers had gathered. Samuel Turner white as chalk, Dr. Hayes refusing to meet anyone's eyes, Martha Whitfield clutching her shawl like a shield. Elder Josiah Thompson limped forward, leaning heavy on his cane. At 73, he was the last living member of the original council of 3 who had decided the settlement's survival was worth any price. "You'll find nothing there but roots and regret," he rasped. Brennan's face hardened. "Then roots and regret will have to answer in court. Men, spades." It did not take long. 3 feet down, iron struck metal. The first thing to see daylight in 16 years was a gold pocket watch, chain green with verdigris, crystal cracked exactly as Rebecca had said. Then a rotted leather pouch that had once held $200 in coin. Finally a horse's bridle, the bit still stained dark. Thomas Brennan turned the watch over with shaking fingers. Inside the lid, in ornate script, M.W. Elder Thompson made a sound like a wounded animal and sat down hard in the dirt. "There are others," he said, voice breaking like old ice. 7, maybe 8 in all. The trail was lonely. Winter was cruel. We told ourselves we were only taking what God had sent us. Then Webb fought back, and things went wrong. He looked up at the church, his church, built with blood money, mortared with children's bones. After the Whitmans, we swore never again. But the ground was already cursed. We could feel it watching us every Sunday. Pastor Phillips felt his knees buckle. He knelt in the raw earth beside the old man and wept. Not pretty preacher tears, but the ugly, retching sobs of a man whose entire world has just collapsed into its own grave. Above them, Rebecca and Rachel stood hand in hand. Rebecca spoke once more, so softly only Phillips heard. "It's almost finished," she said, "but not tonight. Tonight the ground needs to bleed a little more." Far away, a crow called 3 times and would not call again. And beneath the church floor, something that had waited 16 years shifted in its sleep and began to wake. The sun that rose over Pine Hollow on Tuesday, November 18th, 1834, looked ashamed. It was a thin, watery light that could not reach the shadows pooled beneath the pines, could not warm the raw gouge behind the church where Marcus Webb's watch had spent 16 winters rusting beside his stolen life. By 9 o'clock the settlement was overrun with law, for horses steamed in the cold, their riders dismounting with the stiff authority of men who had ridden all night from the county seat. Sheriff McKenzie, broad, red-faced, practical as a boot sole. Judge Elias Harrison, silver hair, eyes the color of winter steel. 2 federal marshals whose coats still carried Louisville dust and the smell of gun oil. They turned the sanctuary into a courtroom without asking permission. The communion table became the bench. The mourner's bench became the witness stand. And the crude pine pulpit, built by Jacob Whitman's own hands, now looked down on the judgment of the men who had murdered him. Every soul in Pine Hollow was ordered inside. Children sat on parents' laps and were told to be still or taste the switch later. Old women clutched shawls to their throats as if the fabric could keep the truth out. Elder Josiah Thompson sat in the front pew between Samuel Bradford and Marcus Perry. 3 gray men who had once been kings of this valley, now shrunk inside their coats like apples left too long in the cellar. Thompson's hands shook so badly the chains on his wrists sang a faint metallic hymn. Judge Harrison did not waste time on ceremony. "Rebecca Morrison," he called, voice sharp enough to cut rope. "Step forward." Rebecca walked the aisle alone. Her shoes, hand-me-downs 2 sizes too big, clacked against the very boards that had drunk blood. She looked no older than a china doll, yet every eye followed her as though she carried a loaded rifle. "Child," the judge said, softer now, "tell this court, plain, how you know where Marcus Webb's watch was buried."
Instead, he stood in this very spot 16 years ago and said he'd ride to Lexington unless we gave every penny back and turned ourselves in. Thompson's knees buckled. The marshals caught him before he fell. That night, he brought Mary and the girls here for sanctuary. Mary was heavy with child. Twins again, the midwife said. 8 months gone. We followed them. We meant only to scare Jacob. But Hope had fever and started crying. Someone, God forgive me, I no longer remember whose hand, covered her mouth too long. Rebecca's small voice floated into the silence like a knife. Tell them about the babies, Mr. Thompson. The old man made a sound no human throat should make. Mary was carrying twins, he sobbed. Boys, the doctor thought. When it was over, we saw the truth. 2 tiny boys, perfect, no bigger than sparrows. We told ourselves they were too small to have souls. That it didn't count. Rachel stepped forward until she stood directly beneath the cross. Every soul counts, she said, soft but merciless. Faith and Hope had sisters that night who never drew breath. 4 little girls waiting under the floorboards. That's why we hear them so loud. 4 voices are harder to ignore than 2. Pastor Phillips felt his faith fracture along fault lines he had never known were there. He had baptized babies in this building. Married couples. Preached resurrection while standing on murdered children, born and unborn. Judge Harrison's voice cut clean through the weeping. Elder Thompson, do you confess to the murders of Jacob Whitman, Mary Whitman, their daughters Hope and Faith, and 2 unborn sons?
Ido.
The words fell like stones into deep water. And to 11 travelers. Bradford and Perry with me every time. The 2 other old men nodded, beyond speech. The judge turned back to the twins. If what you say is true, can you lead us to the rest? Rebecca closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were ancient. Some are in the played-out mine shaft east of the ridge. 6 men, weighted with stones. 2 are deep in Devil's Creek where the water runs black. But 3. She pointed one small finger at the floorboards beneath the judge's boots. 3 are right here. Mixed in the mortar when you laid this floor. 1 still has a gold tooth. 1 still wears a wedding ring that says, Forever, Sarah. Sheriff Mackenzie stood so fast his chair toppled. Your Honor, permission to tear up these boards? Granted, Harrison said grimly. And God have mercy on every soul in this room. They began at the altar. The first axe blow sounded like the world splitting open. Splinters flew. Dust rose thick and choking. Men worked in silence, faces shining with sweat despite the cold. 6 inches down the blades struck something that was not stone. A collective intake of breath. A marshal reached in and lifted out a human jawbone, still wearing a glint of gold. Then a skeletal hand, finger bones laced through a plain gold band etched with the words Forever, Sarah. Pastor Phillips dropped to his knees in the sawdust and vomited until nothing came but sobs. Rebecca and Rachel stood at the edge of the ruin, hand in hand, dry-eyed. It's almost over, Rebecca whispered to the empty air. You can rest soon. But Rachel shook her head. Not yet. 1 more thing has to burn. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, howling through the open doors like something alive trying to escape. Judge Harrison slammed his makeshift gavel against the communion table. This court stands in recess until the dead are accounted for. Sheriff, take the prisoners to the county seat. Marshals, ride for warrants. Every man, woman, and child who knew and stayed silent will answer. And you, he looked at the twins with something between fear and reverence, you have done more for justice today than 20 circuits of law. Ezekiel Morrison moved to gather his daughters, but they resisted. Not yet, Papa, Rachel said. There's 1 more grave that needs marking. She walked to the back wall of the sanctuary, placed her palm against the logs, and closed her eyes. Here, she said. Behind the paneling. Pastor Hayes put her here so he could hear her crying when he preached. He thought it was penance. The sheriff himself swung the crowbar. The logs gave way to a hollow space no bigger than a breadbox. Inside lay a tiny bundle wrapped in a rotted quilt. Even the hardest marshal turned away. 2 infants, twins, curled together as though still in the womb, preserved by the cold and the lime. On the quilt, faded embroidery, M.W., Mary Whitman's own hand. Pastor Phillips crawled forward on his knees and pressed his forehead to the floor directly above where the family had died. Forgive us, he wept into the blood-soaked dust. "Lord Jesus Christ, forgive us all." But the twins only looked up at the cross, rough-hewn by Jacob Whitman's murdered hands, and spoke the last words anyone would ever hear them say in Pine Hollow. "Rebecca, they forgive. Rachel, but they will never forget." That night the church burned. No one saw who set the torch. Some said the wind carried sparks from a careless pipe. Others swore they saw 4 small shadows, 2 in Sunday dresses, 2 no bigger than dolls, dancing in the flames before the roof fell in. By morning only the stone foundation remained, cracked and black, with strange red stains that would not wash away no matter how many winters passed. The settlement emptied within a month. Families loaded wagons and fled as though the ridge itself had turned against them. Pastor Phillips was last to leave. He nailed a single plank across the ruins with words burned deep by his own shaking hand. "Here stood a house of God, built on the bones of the innocent. Let no man raise another, until the blood is satisfied." The Morrison family was seen one final time on the Western Trail, heading toward Tennessee. Ezekiel walked ahead, satchel slung over his shoulder. The twins followed, holding hands, never looking back. Travelers would later swear that wherever those little girls passed, dogs refused to bark and roses bloomed out of season, blood-red against the snow. And in the quiet places of the Cumberland, when the wind moves just right through the pines, some say you can still hear 4 small voices singing the hymn Jacob Whitman wrote the week before he died. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow, I will fear no evil." They never finish the verse. They never need to. The valley already knows. The church smelled of fresh split pine, old blood, and the sour sweat of dying lies. 3 days the men had worked, axes, crowbars, bare hands, tearing the sanctuary apart plank by plank, shovelful by shovelful, until the floor was a raw wound in the earth. Each discovery was laid out on a horse blanket like offerings at a funeral no one wanted to attend. A gold wedding band etched "Forever, Sarah." A silver knife with a mother-of-pearl handle. A copper preacher's cross still warm from the neck it had circled 16 years ago. And beneath it all, the tiny, perfect skeletons of 2 unborn boys curled together like question marks no one would ever answer. On the 4th morning the twins stood in the wreckage, barefoot in the sawdust, looking suddenly, heartbreakingly, like the children they were. Rebecca's lip trembled. Rachel's eyes were ringed violet with exhaustion. "Papa," Rebecca whispered, "the voices are so loud now they hurt. Can we go home?" Ezekiel Morrison knelt in the ruin of the altar and pulled both girls against his chest. His coat smelled of wood smoke and endless roads. "Soon, little doves," he murmured into their hair. "Just one more truth. Then we leave this valley to its reckoning." Outside, the sky hung low and iron gray. A storm was coming. No one doubted it. The kind of storm that washes blood out of the ground and carries it down the mountain in red rivers. Judge Elias Harrison stood on the stump that had once been the communion table and spoke the sentence that ended Pine Hollow forever. 11 murders. For innocents slaughtered on sacred ground. A community built with money pried from dying men's fingers. Elder Josiah Thompson, Samuel Bradford, Marcus Perry, you will hang by the neck until dead. The buildings raised with stolen gold will be sold. Every penny will go to the widows and orphans you made. Pine Hollow ceases to exist this day. A low moan moved through the crowd. Mothers clutching babies, old men staring at the homes they would never sleep in again. 16 years of plow and prayer, baptism and burial, wiped away in one cold paragraph of law. Pastor William Phillips stood among them, coat unbuttoned, collar askew, looking like a man who had seen the inside of his own coffin. He stepped forward, voice raw. "The church must burn," he said simply. "Nothing built on those bones can stand before God." Judge Harrison started to object. Evidence, procedure, the law, but something in Philip's eyes stopped him cold. Solomon Brennan, the Lexington solicitor, closed his ledger with a soft snap. "Let it burn," he said. "Some stains even restitution can't wash out." Elder Thompson, 80 years old and 3 weeks from the gallows, lifted his chained hands toward the twins. "Before you go, children, tell me true. Do they forgive us? In your dreams, do Jacob and Mary and the little ones, do they forgive?" Rebecca walked to him slowly, fearlessly, and placed her small hand over his trembling ones. "Faith says fear made you monsters," she answered, soft as falling ash. "Hope says love can make you human again. They forgive. But they will never, ever forget." Rachel added, so quietly the wind almost stole it. "And forgetting is the only thing that would let you rest." Thunder cracked directly overhead, close enough to rattle teeth. The twins turned as one and walked out of the roofless church, past the gaping hole where the altar had been, past the tiny bundled bones waiting for Christian burial. They did not look back. Ezekiel followed, satchel slung across his shoulder, the weight of 9 years of impossible truth bowing his spine. At the edge of the clearing, Rebecca paused and spoke without turning. "Tell Pastor Phillips the fire will start behind the north wall. Pastor Hayes left lamp oil there for this exact night. He always knew the truth would need cleansing flame." Then they were gone, 3 figures swallowed by the mountain mist as completely as if the ridge itself had inhaled them. The storm broke at dusk. Rain lashed sideways, hard enough to bruise. Lightning stitched white scars across the sky. No one saw the first tongue of flame lick up behind the north wall. Some swore later it started in 3 places at once. Others said they saw 4 small shadows, 2 in blue Sunday dresses, 2 no bigger than candle flames, dancing in the heart of the blaze, singing a hymn in voices too old for children. By the time the first shout went up, the roof was already crowned with fire. Men ran with buckets, but the water turned to steam before it touched the walls. The church burned with a heat that felt personal, vengeful, almost joyful. Pastor Phillips stood in the downpour and watched 16 years of careful hypocrisy turn to smoke. When the bell cracked and fell, the sound was exactly like a neck snapping on the gallows. At dawn only the foundation stones remained, black, split, weeping red where the blood had baked into the mortar. Across one charred timber someone later found words burned deep, as though by a hand that held the torch. "Let no man rebuild, until the ground forgets." And the ground never forgets. 3 weeks later Pine Hollow was a name on a map no one bothered to print anymore. Families scattered like chaff, some to Tennessee, some to the Ohio country, a few as far as Texas. They took nothing but the clothes on their backs and the knowledge that every prayer they had ever spoken in that place had risen through the ribs of murdered men. Pastor Phillips rode east alone. He would spend the rest of his life planting small churches in honest dirt, preaching a gospel stripped of pride and ornament. He kept one thing from Pine Hollow, a single splintered plank from the original altar. He nailed it above every new pulpit he ever stood behind, a silent reminder that some foundations rot from the inside. The Morrison family vanished from the records sometime in the early 1840s. Some said the twins died young, the weight of the dead finally too heavy for children's hearts. Others claimed they simply stopped speaking the truths no one wanted to hear and lived quiet lives under different names, raising gardens and babies and never once dreaming of blood beneath floorboards. But the stories never stopped. In every hollow and valley of Appalachia where old sins still fester, travelers still speak of encountering twin sisters on lonely roads, girls forever 9 years old, barefoot even in snow, eyes too wise for mortal children. They ask for nothing. They only stop long enough to tell you whose bones lie beneath the old church foundation, or where your grandfather really hid that missing deed, or why your mother wakes screaming on the anniversary of a night no one ever speaks of. Then they walk on, hand in hand, singing that unfinished hymn under their breath. Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. They never finish the verse. They never need to. The valley already knows the rest. And somewhere, beneath a foundation that was never properly consecrated, for small souls, 2 who drew breath, 2 who never did, keep watch with perfect patience. They have forgiven. They have not forgotten. And they never will. Final shot. Slow zoom on the ruined foundation stones, red stains glowing faintly in the moonlight. Voiceover, barely above a whisper. Truth is not gentle. Justice is not kind. Sometimes both need children's voices. To scream loud enough to wake the dead. Screen fades to black. If you carry a secret older than your bloodline, sleep lightly tonight. They still walk the ridges. And they know your name.